So today's motion is India's democracy is under severe threat. And I will now start the first poll for you to vote, which you should see on your screens in a minute. So you're being asked to vote yes, no, or I don't know on the motion that India's democracy is under severe threat. While you are voting, let me outline again what we are debating today. With over 1 billion people casting a vote during elections, India is the largest democracy in the world. Ursula von der Leyen, president of the EU Commission, just a few days ago said at a conference in India, as vibrant democracies, India and the European Union share common values and interests, end quote. But both Freedom House and the VDEM Institute, nonprofit organizations, have downgraded India's status as a democracy last year from free to partly free in the first case, and from electoral democracy to electoral autocracy in the latter. People who proclaim the downfall of Indian democracy usually bring up a range of issues, from the freedom of press and academia, with several journalists having facing criminal charges by authorities in the last few years, the state of the judicial branch in India, lack of opposition against the ruling BJP party, and finally the Hindutva movement getting stronger with its discrimination against Indian Muslims and other minorities. I'm going to leave the poll for 5 more seconds. So if you haven't voted, please do now. And then I'm going to close it. Excellent. Thank you very much for all your votes. And it's now time to introduce today's panelists. Let me introduce the teams now. Arguing for the motion are Debasish Roy Chowdhury, who's an Indian journalist, writer, and editor based in Hong Kong. He used to live and work in Calcutta, where he also currently is, and is joining us from Sao Paulo, Bangkok, and Beijing. He co-authored the book To Kill a Democracy, India's Passage to Despotism, published last year. Joining him from Paris is Christophe Jaffrelot, a senior research fellow at the CERI-Sciences Po University. He's a professor of Indian politics and sociology at King's College London and president of the French Political Science Association. He's a columnist in the Indian Express and also, since a few months, member of the board of the newly created Asia Society France, our sister organization in France. On the other side, and arguing against today's motion, are Tripurdaman Singh, who is a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies at the University of London, and the author of 3 acclaimed books about Indian politics and history. Joining him is Vidya Venkat, who is a doctoral researcher in the Department of Anthropology at the SOAS University of London. She has worked in India for over a decade as a journalist and communications expert. She's received several awards and fellowships, and her writings have been widely published in Indian and international publications. Thank you all for joining us today and for agreeing to debate. And we're starting now with opening statements, where you have 4 minutes on the clock. It's traditional that the team arguing in favor of the motion is starting. So Christophe, the floor is yours for your opening statement arguing in favor of today's motion for 4 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nico. So as you just said, India is known as the world's largest democracy because of its record number of voters. And India is still seen as a democracy because elections continue to take place on a regular basis, every 5 years at the national and state levels. But the electoral scene is not a level playing field anymore, and for many reasons. One, the ruling party, the BJP, is much richer than opposition parties. It has spent about $3.5 billion in the 2019 elections to saturate the public space with the image and the discourse of Narendra Modi. Two, the media coverage of the election campaigns favor the Modi government in terms of exposure and because of a clear bias. Journalists do not ask difficult questions to the prime minister, and he does not give press conferences anyway. The mainstream media have lost some of their independence, TV channels in particular, and that was reflected yesterday in the last ranking of RSF. Third, we've seen opposition leaders and journalists harassed by the government, victims of income tax raids, and going behind bars for a tweet. And often these intimidation practices rely on the misuse of draconian anti-terrorist laws. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second one is India's democracy is also under threat because of the situation that prevails between elections. Democracy implies more than elections. It implies the observance of the rule of law, checks and balances, the respect of key institutions, which are today undermined in India. Let me just give you a few examples. The list could be very long. But let's look at Parliament. Parliament has declined, not only because Narendra Modi doesn't sit in Parliament often, but also because many bills are passed the day they are introduced without any debate, and parliamentary committees are short-circuited the same way. More importantly, a key institution, the judiciary, which used to be so independent that it dared to oppose the government of India, probably more than in any other democracy in the world, is now approving everything the ruling party does, or it abstains from expressing itself. Why? Because the government refuses to appoint judges who do not appear as pliable as they would wish, and also because the government blackmails judges about whom it has a file. Besides these institutions, universities and NGOs are targeted too. The government fights against dissenting voices in universities by appointing fellow travelers as presidents of public universities, or by dissuading the businessmen who have created private universities to hire independently minded VCs. And NGOs since 2014 cannot get money from abroad the way they could before. 2/3 of them have disappeared in a country which used to be a country of NGOs. So these are the main reasons why I would consider that India's democracy is under threat, but they, of course, will present even more important factors to my mind.
Thank you very much, Christophe. Excellently argued and also perfectly within your time limit. So thank you for that. Let's move it right along to hear the opening statement of the team arguing against the motion. And for that, I'm handing over to Vidya Venkat in London. Vidya, you have 4 minutes on the clock.
So I would like to open this debate with a question. Where is this perceived threat to India's democracy coming from? Now, it's argued, as Christopher pointed out, that the ruling powers in India and also their right-wing ideological organizations are engaging in various acts to undermine the institutions of democracy. But I'd like to challenge this framing of the narrative, because the ruling powers do not signify the whole of India, a country of 1.38 billion people. And in any democracy, it is the people who hold the levers of power. Now, we are talking about the electoral successes of the BJP, but we also need to consider the facts at hand that since December 2018, BJP has also lost power in many states in India. Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh, Maharashtra, Jharkhand, West Bengal, Tamil Nadu. And in 2022, though the analysis focused on the overall BJP victory in Uttar Pradesh, for example, their seats tally have declined steadily since the 2017 assembly elections, where it had 312 seats. In the 2019 general election, it came down in UP to 275. And in the 2022 assembly elections, the seats tally came down further to 255 seats. Now, what this shows and what I want to argue is the same people who are today voting the Hindu majoritarian BJP to power are also capable of voting them out of power. So we ought to understand that India's electoral arena is a competitive space, and wherever the BJP had a strong opposition, they have failed to make inroads. And West Bengal and Tamil Nadu are very good examples of this. So I'm citing these instances only to emphasize that the BJP's political reach is not absolute. democracy is still intact in India, and that is why this is happening. Also, elections are not the only indicators of a healthy democracy. We need to look at what's happening in the sphere of civil society. So if India was truly leaning towards autocracy, as is being claimed, then the farmers' movement could not have witnessed the sort of unprecedented success it did last year, which forced Narendra Modi to retreat steps to adopt the immensely unpopular farm laws. Now, in fact, the CEO of the Niti Aayog famously noted that there was too much democracy in India, obstructing the path of tough reforms. So what the success of the farm movement shows is that no government can sustain unfriendly policies that go against the will of the masses if it wants to stay in power. So had Modi not pulled back these laws, the assembly election results in Uttar Pradesh would have looked very different today. Now, despite that pullback, the party lost elections in Punjab, which is the grain bowl state of India, and where the fledgling Aam Aadmi Party managed to sweep the polls. So another example of good civil society resistance was what was witnessed in Shaheen Bagh, against the Citizenship Amendment Act in 2020, which affected the BJP's poll performance in Delhi Assembly elections in 2020. Now, two other aspects that are often brought up when we talk about this threat to India's democracy is the state of the judiciary and the press. But again, my question is, were things any different before? Because both the judiciary and the press in India have traditionally leaned towards pro-establishment behavior. Now, in a book published in 2019, Chintan Chandrachud, for example, showed that the Indian judiciary has at times been more executive-minded than the executive itself. And in 2011, a study of English and Hindi dailies in India by Vipul Mudgal showed that the newspapers overwhelmingly cited establishment figures as authoritative sources in their stories, and their views are often carried uncritically in the press. And as someone myself who's worked in the Indian press for many years, I can personally vouch that journalists in India are routinely expected to pander to those holding political power. So what we are observing today is not new, and it doesn't surprise me at all. Now, I'd like to conclude by saying that what India is witnessing today is very much in line with past continuities. The Constitution of India enables...
I'm sorry, I have to, you've run out of time, so to be fair to the other participants, I have to cut you off, but I do want to, you said you wanted to conclude by saying that what's happening today is in line with the past, and that's definitely something we're going to come back to later, so hold on to that thought, because I think that's an important part. But for now, I would like to move it along for a short rebuttal of 4 minutes, again, from the team arguing in favor of the motion. And here the floor is Debasish Roy Chowdhury speaking to us from Kolkata. Please, Deb.
Thank you. Thank you, Nico. Greetings, everybody. As Christophe said, India's democratic institutions are in various stages of capture and capitulation, which puts a giant question mark on the quality of democracy. If you can win elections with pots of cash and private armies, and if you can manipulate the media and control institutions, it doesn't matter how frequently you hold elections, you're still what Jefferson would call an elective despotism, and what, as you mentioned, Sweden's Vidya Institute calls an electoral autocracy, which is how it describes India these days. And like many global trackers, democracy trackers, VDM does not consider India a full-fledged democracy anymore, as you said, and neither should you. Now, I would like to point out two things here. One, when we talk about the threats to Indian democracy, we also need to consider its growing inequality. A system based on equal vote becomes a farce in a grotesquely unequal society, and India has grown much more unequal than before. That itself constitutes a grave threat to democracy, even if we leave aside the issues of broken democratic institutions. Two, even when we do talk about broken democratic institutions, we have to remember that these pathologies are not unique to the federal government. You see the same dynamic of power grab across the country at the state level, and I'm with Vidya on this here. Also, the threat to Indian democracy is actually more widespread than we usually understand it to be. Remember, Modi is not the only despot in India. There are many smaller despots. In fact, Modi himself was a small despot before he became this big despot. But there is a vital difference between him and others, his party and the other parties, a difference which makes this moment in India's history particularly dangerous. Unlike the Hindu supremacists, the others are not ideologically committed to any culture war against Muslims and Christians. We are witnessing India's inclusive democracy quite literally being bulldozed. In this past month of Ramadan, we have seen how the Indian state has used bulldozers to destroy Muslim homes and businesses, and as a form of collective punishment, in complete disregard of the law. Muslims already face violence and humiliation from Hindu vigilante groups who are protected by the state. These groups freely indulge in free crime like lynching and hate speech, like open calls for. But now the state itself has started to act like the lynch mob in destroying Muslim lives and property by sending in the bulldozers. So the fact of the matter is that the elected government of the world's biggest democracy is destroying the idea of equal citizenship, and the democratic institutions are too weak to push back. Now, democracy, as we all know, has to have equal rights and freedom for everybody. By definition, because elections are about numbers, or the rights and freedoms of the majority are naturally protected through elections. But a democracy's mettle of equal citizenship is tested by how it treats its minorities. And India is failing that test every day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deb, for this rebuttal from the team arguing in favor of the motion. And now, last but not least, it's time for the rebuttal of the other team arguing against the motion. And for that, we're turning to our last speaker, Tripurdaman, dialing in from Paris as well. Please, the floor is yours for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Nico, and thank you to everyone who's joined us. I'll quickly run down some of my points, and then I'll look at what the others have said. So I'm going to start by saying that India is the only democracy in the world that, without the need for any declaration of emergency, gives its executive lawmaking powers. It allows its government to legislate in place of parliament in the normal course of events, a power given by Article 123 of the Constitution and used liberally since 1950, right from 1950. It is a democracy, for example, where within 15 months of the Constitution's inauguration, before a general election, an unelected parliament amended the Constitution, the First Amendment, on which I've written a book, to drastically curtail free speech. Now, I say these things not as a way of saying, like Vidya has done, that things are have always been like this, but it is to remind everyone that Indian democracy is not and never has been of a kind that would be easily compared to the West or be easily familiar to people living in the West. It is not a Westminster. It is, as my friend Harshan Kumar Singham says, it is an Eastminster, a typology of its own. It has and it has always had a kind of authoritarianism and a kind of communitarianism embedded in its constitutional and institutional framework. Liberalism is the weakest strand in India's constitutional arrangement. Even India's founding fathers always said the constitution is first and foremost there to hold the country together, to safeguard the unity and integrity of the state, and second, to facilitate a social revolution. Democracy, freedom, and liberalism are the weakest strand that one can find in the Indian constitution, and this has always been so. It's always been a country first and foremost to target poverty, to uplift its people, and to hold the state together. That is the primary purpose of India's constitution. Yet, the things that have been cited as threats, for example, by Christophe, such as the state of parliament or restrictions on free speech or this sort of ultra powerful executive that has come to be. These are things that are constitutionally enshrined. These have been there since 1950. Of course, every government has sort of built step by step on it. You could look, again, I use an example to go through Christophe's point of this functioning of parliament. You have something called the 10th schedule, which basically obliges MPs on the risk of disqualification to vote as they're told by their party leader or by the party whip, which makes India's parliament very, very different from anywhere else. Of course, there are questions about the BJP's ethno-majoritarian impulses, and perhaps while they do threaten Indian liberalism, I don't think they threaten Indian democracy. Everything that's been cited, if this indeed is a threat to Indian democracy, I would say Indian democracy has been under this sort of threat right from 1950 itself. And so this should be seen as the norm. And the coalition period between 1989 and 2014 should be seen as an anomaly, where since there was little concentration of power and power was dispersed among many stakeholders, it allowed for greater checks and balances. But this in India has always been the case, where when you have a government with a full majority, it kind of, it kind of holds the reins, and it sort of pulls things up. And whenever that sort of majority dissipates, power dissipates within the system, and you have institutions sort of push back. So I don't think this should be seen as this sort of huge threat as it's being made out to be.
Thank you, Tripurdaman, for this final rebuttal and statement in this first part of the debate. This concludes the first part of the debate, and we're now moving on to Q&A. Again, to the audience joining us online, we welcome your questions in this part. If you want to ask a question, please submit it using the Q&A function that you see on your screen, and then I will grab some of the best questions from there. But I do want to start, Vidya and Tripurdaman, with you. You both seem to partially in your statements have used sort of the historical argument by saying, that the shortcomings of Indian democracy, while there, are really nothing new. They've been around since independence. They've been around sort of since India is a democracy, and there's really sort of a historical line to be drawn to today. Yet I want to, and Vidya would like to ask you specifically about this. We've talked about some of these indicators that sort of show a decline in democracy, and it just so happens that yesterday was World Press Freedom Day, and on this day, there's the Press Freedom Index that's being released for every country on the planet. And I looked at it, and India now ranks in 150th place out of 180 countries surveyed. It dropped again 8 spots from last year. There are, of course, we've already talked about this, multiple reports of journalists being threatened or harassed or even jailed because supposedly they are critical of the government. So would you not have to agree that there is, in that regard, a downward trend? Clearly, apparently on some of these metrics, India used to rank a lot better, and now it's going downward. So how can you make the argument that this is just basically a historical constant? My research is on the right to information movement, and I just want to point out something from there. I know I'm going a little bit back, but I will get to where you are right now. The Official Secrets Act was passed by the British government to make sure that the press does not carry anything that is embarrassing to it. And this was done by the British government, first in England, and then the law was also, passed in India by the British government. So the government has always had a problem with the press, and nobody who is in power wants anything to be written that shows them in a poor light. And as journalists, we all know that. I mean, I've worked as a journalist for many years. I've worked as a journalist when the BJP was in power. I've worked as a journalist when other parties were in power, and these rankings keep going up and down. Okay, but I would say that the tendency for those in power to suppress someone who's speaking against them is something that has always been there since a very long time. And I would say that this is a struggle that defines democracy itself. I wouldn't say that, I would say that it's very short-sighted for us to look at it as something that is only happening now. That is what I would like to say, that this struggle in itself is part of what makes democracy is what I would like to say. Okay, thank you. Let me quickly stick sort of to this kind of the historical dimension of this argument and turn to you, Deb. Something that I found very interesting that someone who knows a lot about India has told me recently is that India has once been called the most reckless experiment in political history. Apparently no other country on the planet has introduced democracy at a time when the average income was as low as in India. India has also not experienced, since it has become a democracy, the average growth of GDP that political scientists agree that is necessary to sustain democracy. And yet, it has endured. And many people, many analysts have, proclaimed or predicted the demise of Indian democracy over the years and the decades, and so far, they have all been wrong. So, Deb, when we look at the historical context and the long duration, what makes you so sure that it's different this time? How is the threat to Indian democracy today different from the threats it has experienced in the past? All of which I think we can say it probably has survived. What makes you so sure it won't survive this time? And I think you're still on mute, Deb. There we go.
Sorry. Yes, I won't say that I am sure that it won't survive, because as I have mentioned in our book, India's amazing diversity, its multiple languages, its multiple cultures, they act as an natural counterforce or to any force of political hegemony or monolithism. So also any kind of politics that wants to impose a uniform culture over India will, after a point, face pushback from regional forces, because it militates against the ingrained diversity of India. So also, I would say that of course, Indian democracy is under serious threat, but I'm not saying that there is no redemption, that there is no comeback. But at the moment, what we're discussing is that it is under severe threat, and there is no questioning that. And I would quickly say that I'm surprised that Vidya actually compared the current government's attitude towards the press or to the British Raj, governments to democracy. I mean, that itself says a lot about the point in democracy that we are in right now in India. And this current government's record of democracy, as Christophe has been outlining, this institutional decay and everything, this we have Vidya correctly said that these are long-running pathologies, but the way they have intensified in the last 8 years is amazing, these pathologies. And remember that this is the first time in India's history that you have a government whose goal is not just to win the next election. It has a larger purpose. It is committed, ideologically committed to change the foundation of the state. It is ideologically committed to destroy the inclusive character of the Indian state. It is openly hostile to the idea of secularism, and it is becoming a hegemonic power. Also, there are differences between now and what we have seen before. It cannot be dismissed as, oh, we have been there before and the people have spoken and everything will be fine. I don't know if everything will be fine. I think everything will be fine because people will militate, but I'm not sure. And as of now, there are massive difficulties which are encountering, which are staring at India's democracy as of now. And there's no denying that fact.
Thank you, Deb. We already getting a lot of questions also from the audience. Want to make sure we can address at least some of these. So let me move on. One thing that Deb and especially Christophe have mentioned, and Tripurdaman, that I would like to ask you about, is sort of this independence of the judicial branch. Now, it seems to me that an independent judiciary really is fundamental to a functioning democracy beyond, just having free elections. So, how would you respond to that? Would you either disagree with the fact that the Indian judiciary is not independent anymore, or not independent enough anymore, or would you even argue that an independent judiciary is not a threat to democracy?
The Indian judiciary, as Vidya said, has traditionally been executive-minded, and actually, if you look at the record of India's Supreme Court, especially in sort of holding up the ideals of democracy and liberalism, it's actually quite poor. And Christophe has written a book on the emergency. He'll be well aware. Like it even held the emergency legal. We have to see this in context that India's judiciary, while independent, has traditionally had an executive bent. India's constitution has an executive bent. It creates an all-powerful executive, and it creates an all-powerful executive for a particular purpose. Those powers are there for the government to use. Now, we might disagree with the BJP's ideological project, fair enough, but in the 8 years that it's been in power, it has not needed to create any special legal or judicial tools to get its own way. I don't think that reflects particularly badly on it, or particularly badly on the Indian judiciary. The Indian judiciary is independent. There has never really been a charge, or nobody has openly called for, I guess, progressive judges, as it used to be the demand in the 1970s. And I don't think we can hold the fact that the judiciary has given a large number of judgments which could be seen as upholding executive power as anything out of the ordinary. The Indian constitution itself is executive-minded. And just to make a quick point, again, I would, you have rankings drop on for example, you'd mentioned the Press Freedom Index. Most of these indexes came into being during the coalition era, and that's the point that I'm making, is we have to see the period between 1989 and 2014 as an anomaly. I don't think it can be taken to be the norm in Indian politics and Indian society when power was so dispersed.
Thank you. Christophe, finally, I want to turn to you with a question. I mentioned in my introduction that EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was in India literally just a few days ago and praised Indian democracy and said it was vibrant. Now, you can think of the EU and its commission what you want, but it does seem to me that its stance on democracy is quite strong. It has famously sued some of its own members for not being democratic enough, or trying to sort of erode institutions. So would that not suggest that the EU, at least in the person of Ursula von der Leyen, disagrees with you? And how would you respond to that? Why does the EU Commission see this differently than you are?
Well, you need to differentiate what people say in public and what they say in private. The month before she went to India, the man in charge of human rights in Brussels had spent quite some time in India as well, meeting human rights activists, NGOs, academics, and is reporting to the EU Parliament that has itself, exactly 1 month ago, listed a very large number of concerns. The EU Parliament, like the American Congress, by the way, are much more interested in these issues. But our governments, the Western governments, need India against China, and therefore do not raise this kind of issues with the Modi government. But Nico, since this is a debate, I'd like to respond to some of the responses I've received, if you don't mind, because I think my time is not up, and I'd like to just list some bullet points. One, if the farmers' movement shows that democracy is vibrant, then there is a real problem, because you should not need to demonstrate for 2 years and lose more than 100 lives for having the laws withdrawn. I think it's, on the contrary, a symbol of the lack of responsiveness of the government towards the poor and the farmers of India. Secondly, judiciary was not pro-establishment to the extent it is. Indira Gandhi was condemned by the UP High Court for a Peccati law. And we had judicial activism in the 90s, which made a big difference. There is just no comparison with what happened in the past. And if we have to go back to the emergency for making this point, well, it shows that the democracy of India is even in worse shape than anticipated, because during the emergency there was just no habeas corpus left, nothing was left. I agree, India has invented a very original brand of democracy, a non-individualistic brand of democracy, where caste played a role, for instance. And when you keep this historical perspective that you have adopted, clearly, you see a democratization of India with the rise of plebeians, Dalits, OBCs. The turning point is in the 1990s, and we saw that they were taking over. That's why we saw also a response that was Hindu nationalism, and upper caste are back in office, which is at the expense of democracy. And last but not least, of course, the BJP project, ideological project, results in the making of second-class citizens, the minorities, as Deb has shown. So that's not fair enough. It's a new regime. It's a new system. It's not according to the Constitution.
Thank you very much, Christophe. I see Vidya has...
I would like to add here, Nico.
Just briefly, Deb, and then I want to hear from Vidya, and then we should address some of the audience questions as well. But Deb, go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to add to what Christophe just said, that we cannot say that, okay, we have ethno-nationalism problem with the BJP, but other than that, there is no other than that. There is only one kind of democracy, and if a democracy is not inclusive, it is by definition not a democracy. So this is a big problem. And Vidya, also, I would like to point out that you mentioned the fact that BJP has also lost elections. I would like to remind you that, yes, BJP lost elections and won and just bought over enough legislators in 2 states to form their own government. Also, that is a destruction of democracy right there. I mean, it doesn't matter what people say anymore. If you have enough money, as Christophe said, that money power is...
Okay, Deb, you're breaking up there a little bit, and I'm going to...
If you have enough money...
Let me turn it over to Vidya, who I think wanted to briefly, please, respond to Christophe, and then I would like to use the remaining 5-6 minutes for some audience questions. Vidya, very briefly, thanks.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify in response to what Christopher said, is that, of course, it is unfortunate the number of deaths that happened of farmers, and it was an avoidable tragedy. I would say that, but the point I was trying to make is, in a democracy, a government in power cannot sit and act as it pleases. That is the point I was trying to make, that if they do something that is undemocratic in nature, it will be met with resistance, and the farmers' movement is a very good example of that. It shows that the spirit of democracy is alive in India, and people are not going to act as doormats, and let the government behave as it wants to. If the government does something that is out of line, it will be met with resistance, as we saw in the example of the farmers' movement. I just thought I should clarify that.
Thank you. Tripurdaman, I want to come back to something that you said that was also brought up in several audience questions, which is this distinction between liberalism and democracy. And that does seem important to me, because I think it's something we hear sometimes when the Indian political system is discussed. I think for us here in Europe, this also sort of reminds us of Hungary's Viktor Orban's famous speech, where he sort of declared his country to be an illiberal democracy. Now, I'm probably not alone in sort of being a little bit skeptical of the idea that there can be democracy without liberalism. So could you briefly sort of explain, sort of how you see it possible that a democracy can exist without liberalism? That seems like a contradiction.
that's just the point that I make, that it's only seen as a contradiction if you take the European experience to be the norm, to be, you know, the standard that we all aspire to, but it's not. India, as I said, is a typology of its own. And again, Christophe mentioned that India is not an individualist democracy. It's a rather communitarian society, and it's a rather communitarian democracy, right? If you go back to its founding moment in 1950 to, for example, the First Amendment in 1951, the Constitution privileges the executive. India's founding fathers are very clear that the purpose of the Constitution, as Jawaharlal Nehru said, first and foremost is to clothe the naked millions and feed the starving population, and second is to keep the unity and integrity of the state intact. So this is where the Constitution starts off with. You see this in the debates over the First Amendment. You see this when the free speech is first curtailed, even before India has a general election, even before it has a chance to elect a parliament based on universal franchise. The First Amendment happens, and it happens because they want to curtail free speech, and they want to curtail free speech because, as Prime Minister Nehru says at that point, that the legislature represents the wishes of the people, and if the Constitution comes in the way of the wishes of the people, then, well, the Constitution has to be changed. So the Westminster system runs on precedent and tradition, each step building on the other. And my point when I say this is not to justify Viktor Orban in any way, but it's to say that Indian democracy does not conform to the norm that you might see in Europe, and to argue that it should in itself is to ignore the conditions in which it was born. As you said, you know, it didn't have the sort of wealth or the education, etc. So it lacked all of these background conditions that supposedly make democracy possible. And a lot of what we see as, you know, authoritarian in the Constitution, or authoritarianism in action in the behaviors of the government, is in many cases an answer to these sort of missing preconditions. And it's very easy to theoretically say, well, we should conform to this sort of norm that you see in Europe, but there also has to be an answer to these sort of missing preconditions, and that's my argument.
Thank you. Christophe, I see you have your hand up. I'll let you briefly respond, but I do want to also tack on the following question to you that I was going to ask you anyway, and that a few people in the audience have also raised. So one argument, it seems today, is also a little bit on the nature of sort of the political institution that is the BJP, that sort of makes up the current government. It's been pointed out as well that partially the rise of the BJP was being made possible by the fragmentation and the weakness of the opposition. That was sort of in a way similar to, you know, earlier times when Congress was in power and the opposition to Congress was fragmented. But it seems that the argument that you're making and that Deb is making, that the BJP is fundamentally different, because if you, I think, has mentioned at the beginning that it's much richer, there's just a lot more money. It's been pointed out in the past that it's really not. You can't see it just as a political party. It's an organization in its own right that really lacks comparison outside of India. So could you briefly talk about, you know, sort of how the BJP, in your view, is sort of special and maybe different from political parties that were in power in India previously, and why that, in your view, is a threat to democracy?
I will briefly, but before that, let me respond to this question that is so important. You do not need to compare India to the West, to Europe, for making the point that democracy is declining. You just need to compare it to what it was before. And if you look at liberal values, let's use this formula, we saw under Manmohan Singh the right to information, the decentralization, also in a much more federal context, that was liberal. And secondly, we also saw less inequalities. Inequalities are increasing in India today. They were not that sharp, partly because of the rise of lower caste, as I have mentioned, but also because of NREGA, a minimum wage for the jobless people, and also less indirect taxes. India has an amazing percentage of taxes eating the poor today, including those on the petrol and so on. So it's not something, I would say, foreign to India. There was a recent phase of democratization that is not pursued anymore. Now, your question is key also, Nico, of course, because I argue that the change we are seeing is not a change in terms of party system, but a change in terms of political system, because the BJP is developing an ideology that is majoritarian, that is not inclusive in cultural terms. Minorities, if you go by the ideological charters of BJP, are not bound to remain full citizens. And that's why, incidentally, has been introduced an amendment to the Citizenship Act, the CAA, that for the first time introduces religion as a criterion for defining citizenship. The Muslims, the Muslim refugees from Bangladesh, Pakistan, Afghanistan are not eligible to Indian citizenship. Hindus are, Buddhists are, Christians are, not Muslims. That's new. That's not at all something you would find in the letter and the spirit of the Indian Constitution. And it's not a difference of degree then, it's a difference in kind. Certainly something we see elsewhere. We've seen this in Israel, and that's why, for me, the change we are seeing is bound to transform India into a big Israel where you will have two kinds of citizens if the transformation we are seeing today continues.
Thank you very much, Christophe. And at this point, we have, unfortunately, to end the Q&A part. I know there are many, many unanswered questions, but I hope we were able to address at least some of the questions from the audience. It's now time for the final part of the debate, which are closing statements. Since Christophe just spoke, let me suggest that we give the word first to Deb, arguing in favor of the motion, then followed by Vidya, Christophe, and finally Tripurdaman. So Deb, if that's okay with you, you will have 2 minutes on the clock to make your final case and convince the audience to vote in favor of the motion today.
Okay, thank you. We have heard various arguments for and against the motion today. We have told you about India's feeble institutions, its terrible social inequities, its fragile rights, its war on dissent, and the state of its minorities. But before you cast your vote today, I have just one word for you, that is Assam. Assam is a northeastern state. It's famous for its tea, but now it's infamous for disenfranchising nearly 2 million people through a citizenship verification drive. 2 million people who have lived in India for generations and have never considered themselves anything but Indians now suddenly find themselves stateless with no clear idea as to what happens to them next. Now, this is a model that Modi's government wants to apply nationwide. Modern despotisms often reach a point when instead of the people choosing the rulers, or the rulers decide to choose the people. This is the ultimate distortion of democracy, and India has reached that point. And detention centers for the stateless, the closest regional parallel of what is happening there is the Rohingya in Myanmar, where they were declared stateless, leading to the massacre and exodus. So before casting your vote today, ask yourself, how democratic can India be if it is creating its own Rohingya and building detention centers for them? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deb. And you made a powerful argument, even though there was a little bit of a hitch audio-wise, but I think we got the clear gist from your statement nonetheless. Let me now pass it on to Vidya for her final remarks arguing against today's motion. You have 2 minutes, Vidya.
I would like to close my statement by saying that after hearing everyone, it is pretty clear that we don't have a consensus on what we mean by democracy itself, So I look at democracy as a process, and this process involves a lot of struggle. If we look at the sort of intimidatory tactics that, Christophe and Deb have pointed to in their motion, these tactics actually expose the fragility of those in power because they are desperate to hold the people down. And this is not sustainable in the long run, and this time will also pass. It's only a matter of time, before those who are indulging in so-called undemocratic acts, it's only a matter of time before they are shown the door. It may happen sooner or later. I cannot predict when. Another thing is the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. If you take that example, some 10,000 arrests have been made under that law, but only 200 convictions have happened, which means even if the government is going to use some law to suppress people, it will not pass muster in a court of law. It cannot be upheld. Last year only Natasha Narwal and a lot of other youngsters who were arrested on charges of rioting in Delhi, provoking riots in Delhi, they were released on bail last year. So just to add to my example of how the judicial process will not uphold any excessive act of unfair or unjust act of the government, and that shows that the democratic, the core of democracy is intact, and when we talk about, the freedom of the press being affected, let us also not forget that a lot of online publications have come up in the past few years, which have carried critical analysis against the government. So the thing with suppressing dissent is, you suppress it in one place, it will come up in another place, and that is the essential spirit of democracy in India, and it
Vidya,
cannot be crushed easily.
I have to cut you off, unfortunately. The 2 minutes are...
Yeah, it can't be crushed, is what I'm saying.
Have been up for a little bit now, but thank you very much for that. Christophe Jaffrelot in Paris, it's your turn to speak as the last person from the team in favor of the motion for your final statement, telling people why they should vote with you in agreeing with today's motion.
Well, I'd like to add two more points that have not been raised so far. One, we see a concentration of power in the hands of few men. That is somewhat unprecedented in India. In the hand of the government, at the expense of the party, BJP, at the expense of parliament, at the expense of federalism, and decisions like demonetization or the lockdown could be made without consulting the state governments, for instance. And concentration of power in the hands of few businessmen, oligarchs. You can probably count them on the fingers of both hands, of your two hands nowadays. Oligarchs who are also chronic capitalists who pay for the election campaigns I have mentioned before. So that's a new development, and it contrasts with dissemination of power that was there before under the previous dispensation. And secondly, I'd like to mention the fact that India tends to become somewhat a police state because of the banalization of surveillance techniques, as evident from the Pegasus episode. Journalists of investigation have shown that a spyware made in Israel had been planted in the smartphone of opposition leaders, judges, journalists, and so on. Such things happened elsewhere. In the US during the Watergate, but Nixon had to resign. In India, there is not even a serious inquiry about this kind of practices. Well, I don't know how I would define democracy, but without transparency, a minimum of accountability, I think it is undermined.
Thank you very, very much, Christophe. And finally, let's turn to Tripurdaman, also in Paris right now, arguing for the team against the motion for his final statement of 2 minutes.
A few quick points, and I'll take off from where Christophe said, as he used the term, the sort of a banalization of surveillance. And I would say that this the threats to Indian democracy that have been cited are also quite banal. These, as we've said, have existed in historical context, and they kind of define the experience of Indian democracy itself. It's always been a push and pull between these two sides. 1989 to 2014 saw a coalition era. There was no concentration of power because the Indian voters did not vote in one single party. And even now, if they were to choose to not vote in one single party, you would see all this concentration of power dissipate within a very short amount of time. Like they have voted in a supermajority government, and they can decide as soon as the next election comes around to vote out this government. And as long as they have this power, as long as the procedures of Indian democracy continue to function, it can't be seen to be under threat. Secondly, while RTI and so on and so forth did see, in some senses, a deepening of Indian democracy in the Manmohan Singh era, it also saw draconian legislation such as the UAPA. It saw war on the Naxalites. The levels of violence in central India were unprecedented. And those things should not be forgotten. Those that has also happened. And lastly, I would like to point out that so far, at no point has the current dispensation sought to locate sovereignty or power outside the formal structures of Indian democracy. Nobody has located sovereignty outside Parliament and said, well, it's on the street, and so we can, we can push away the Constitution, or we don't need Parliament. No one has made that claim. No one is making the claim. We've only seen that made in the 70s, and unless we reach that point, Indian democracy is still functioning as it is supposed to function.
Thank you very much, Tripurdaman. And that concludes today's debate. Thank you so much to everybody for participating. It is now time for the final and maybe most important part of today, which is the second vote, where you, the audience, get to decide who was more convincing. The results are ready. I haven't seen them. Let's see them now on screen and see who won. So in the first poll, 63% of you agreed with the motion and 20% disagreed with the motion. 16% said they don't know. In the second poll, 72% agreed with the motion and 19% disagreed. This means a 9% change, positive change for the team arguing in favor of the motion that India's democracy is indeed under severe threat. Christophe and Deb, that means you have won today's debate. Congratulations on arguing your way to victory. Of course, Vidya and Tripurdaman, thank you as well, and congratulations on making your case. This was an intense and fantastic debate, and of course, it's something that we're going to continue discussing going forward. If you're a member of Asia Society Switzerland or dialed in today, I invite you to join us for the separate debriefing with all of our 4 speakers starting right after we end here. You will have received a separate dial-in link. You can just click that and we can spend a few more minutes continuing the conversation there and addressing some of the questions that we didn't have time to address during this debate. To everybody who's participated today, thank you so much for being here and thank you for submitting your vote. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's debate and our program in general. You can give us feedback by the survey that you should receive either when you exit here, you'll see a link pop up, or you will also receive this link by email in the next hour or so. Thank you again from Asia Society Switzerland here in Zurich. Thank you to all of our debaters, and we do hope to see you very soon at the next Asia Society Switzerland event. Goodbye.